Two men grabbed her in a parking garage. Then, the lights went out. Serena was leaving work after midnight when strangers stepped from the shadows and asked why Kyle Moretti cared about her. She fought, screamed, and tasted blood before the entire garage plunged into darkness. When the lights came back, one attacker was unconscious. The other was kneeling, with Kyle Zagai pressed to his skull. Serena thought she had been saved. But saving her meant she now belonged inside his war. Picture the opening shot. The camera pans down from a blinding chandelier to find Serena Vale, totally unaware that the steel jaws of a psychological trap have just snapped shut. She just insulted the heir to a brutal criminal syndicate. A common street thug would have drawn a weapon, but Kyle Moretti possesses the terrifying restraint of a true megalomaniac. He just watches her and smiles. Let us pause right here, because you and I need to unpack this disaster together. In exactly 3 weeks, she will wake up in his dark sheets, entirely consumed by her captor. The devastating life lesson here is profound. The human mind will normalize a monster if it means living to see tomorrow. This hotel was never a celebration. It was always a hunting ground. The harsh lighting exposes the ugly truth about dirty money. Proximity to that kind of wealth completely rots your sense of reality. For 6 months, Serena rewrote her internal compass, watching men in tailored suits fuel manic binges, while politicians hid absolute cruelty behind bright smiles. Tonight was supposed to be a breather. Clean money, she thought. But the tragic reality is that no crime family is truly clean. She stands by the grand entrance, clutching a tablet like it might stop a bullet from these entitled guests. She wears a stark black uniform, silently begging the room to let her vanish. But here is a bitter life lesson we often learn a little too late. The people who try the hardest to be invisible are exactly who a predator spots first. The camera tightens on her face. She plays dead, desperately hoping the danger simply walks past. Serena actually believes keeping her head down will keep her safe as she weaves through the elites toward a champagne display. Then, the focus shifts to Kyle Moretti. He sits flanked by massive men radiating pure violence, but Kyle is the absolute black hole of the room. He carries the heavy magnetic pull of a supreme narcissist, quietly pulling the oxygen from the air. His pale eyes scan the floor like a starving wolf, searching for a wounded deer. Serena read his file, but ink on paper is nothing like feeling the cold draft of his presence. The biological life lesson here is terrifyingly simple, yet undeniably true. Your nervous system always recognizes the wolf first. Watch the slight shift in his posture. Boredom always surfaces right before the cruelty begins. Kyle, this untouchable mob prince, is entirely numb to the noise around him. Serena catches the low rumble of his bodyguards and instantly recognizes that harsh Sicilian dialect from her own childhood block. Then his voice cuts clean through the string quartet. He openly mocks her in his native language, calling her a little girl playing dress-up, assuming she is just another deaf servant. It shatters her perfectly practiced mask. Men like him use casual humiliation, like a sonar ping, bouncing insults off you to map your emotional weak spots. The life lesson here is rough but deeply true. Swallowing an insult might keep you breathing, but it slowly chips away at your soul. The background noise drops to total silence. The worst mistake you can make with a god complex is to puncture the ego. Instead of walking away, Serena steps right into the blast radius. His bodyguards instantly reach inside their jackets. But Serena does not flinch. She locks onto his pale eyes and fires back in flawless Sicilian, mocking him for hiding behind the ghost of his dead father. The entire room holds its breath. The guards wait for the nod to end her, but Kyle barely lifts a finger, freezing them in place. He simply studies her. Here is a counterintuitive life lesson we often forget. Showing fearlessness to a monster does not scare them away. It just upgrades you from a random victim to a total obsession. And then, he smiles. Zoom in on that smile. It is entirely devoid of warmth. It is the cold spark of a predator finding a new toy. Switching smoothly back to unaccented English, Kyle openly admits she impressed him. Serena stays defensive, her voice trembling just slightly, telling him to find a better hobby than tormenting the hotel staff. A guard mutters a lethal threat, but Kyle ignores him completely. His tunnel vision is locked firmly on her. He demands her name. This is the tragic turning point. She should have lied. Just invent a name, snap the fragile thread, and run far away. But she hands him the truth instead. Serena Vale, you and I both know the core life lesson for surviving this dark world. Never give a hunter your real coordinates. By handing over her true name, she locks her own cage. The spell breaks the second her boss yells her name. Serena blinks and drops her gaze. Make no mistake, that drop is a physical surrender. Kyle politely lets her walk away, but the brand is already burning into her skin. For the rest of the shift, he does nothing obvious. He does not yell or reach for her. He simply watches from the shadows. It is a suffocating pressure designed to flood her veins with cortisol. He wants her completely exhausted. He wants the sheer terror of being hunted to strip away her rational mind. It makes her furious, yet her heart races in a twisted rhythm. It is a deeply tragic life lesson, but undeniable. The human brain is genuinely terrible at telling the difference between the pure panic of being hunted and the sudden rush of dark desire. The shift finally ends. The camera follows Serena as she strips off the uniform, stepping out into a massive, echoing concrete parking garage. The lighting is sickly and yellow. We all know this scene. This is where the horror truly drops. Footsteps echo off the walls behind her, and her brain immediately slams into survival mode. She weaves her car keys between her fingers, as if a tiny sliver of metal will stop an organized crime syndicate. She speeds up. The shadow behind her matches her pace perfectly. A rough voice calls her name. The bitter psychological life lesson here is hard to swallow. Society trains us to politely ignore our gut instincts so we do not look crazy in public. But choosing politeness over panic is exactly how the innocent gets swallowed by the dark. Her eyes dart to the unnatural bulge under his dark jacket. This is exactly how men like Kyle operate. They never bloody their own hands. They delegate the terror. The massive guard casually mentions that Mr. Moretti wants to see her. In one breath, all her brave little boundaries are smashed into dust. The man makes it clear that running is useless. Kyle is fixated, and his empire ensures he gets what he wants. She realizes her weekend self-defense classes mean absolutely nothing against a ruthless private army. The real-life lesson here is chilling to the bone. Captivity does not begin when they slide the deadbolt locked. Captivity begins the very second you realize your freedom was only ever a fragile illusion. She lets out a broken, hysterical laugh and stops fighting. Hold the frame right here. Stick with me. Because we need to look at this moment together. It is 2 a.m, an empty, freezing concrete tomb of a garage. This human brick wall is telling her to get into a car with a known mob boss. Every cell in her blood is screaming at her to run toward the distant streetlights. But a horrible, twisted curiosity hooks her. She remembers his pale eyes. He looked at her like a broken puzzle he wanted to crack open. These men do not feel love. They only understand possession. And heaven help her. She wants to know why he chose her. The ultimate life lesson here is vital. Never mistake the terrifying gravity of the abyss for a safe place to land. She whispers that she will give him 5 minutes, slowly walking toward the pitch-black sedan. A dark-tinted window glides down, and Kyle casually tells her to get in. Serena tries to hold a pathetic line of defense, insisting they can talk right there on the freezing concrete. Watch his face. It is pure, arrogant amusement. He complains about the winter wind and drops her first name, forcefully injecting a fake intimacy to tear down her last wall. So, she gets in. The heavy, armored doors thud shut with the absolute sound of a steel vault locking. The massive guard slides into the driver's seat. She is physically boxed in. Before she can even take a breath, the engine roars and the car rips away from the curb, diving deep into the city night. A critical life lesson to remember. Holding on to illusions of safety, like the car keys biting into her knuckles, will not save you. The streetlights cast rhythmic shadows across his face. She demands to know what he wants. He slowly turns to her in the dark, his features locked in the terrifying symmetry of a true psychopath. He completely ignores her panic, softly asking where she learned to speak Sicilian. It knocks her entirely off balance. She stammers out that an old neighbor taught her the words. But when he asks if the neighbor taught her the insult too, she confesses she made that part up. The shift in the car is palpable. He is absolutely fascinated by her reckless nerve. A profound life lesson we rarely discuss. Standing up to power is romanticized in movies, but sometimes it just makes you the most entertaining prey in the room. He lets out a real dark laugh. The trap is closed. The tragedy has begun. The camera holds on the tight, suffocating interior of a speeding black sedan. Washington's seen in the sickly yellow bleed of passing streetlights. You and I can practically feel the air thinning out. Kyle's voice finally breaks the quiet, laying bare the trap she just walked into. She tries to build a wall of defiance, but her trembling fingers give her away entirely. He brushes her panic aside with a cold logic, watching her the way a predator studies a trapped animal. The moment she confesses her terror, his obsession sparks. He whispers that even seasoned men refuse to hold his eye. It reveals a terrifying truth we all eventually learn. When a ruthless person compliments your strength, they are simply measuring how much force it will take to shatter you. He leans in, erasing the space between them. The silence inside the car turns heavy, like that dead quiet, right before a thunderstorm breaks. She desperately holds on to whatever control she has left, her voice rigid as she demands he let her go. He replies with absolute, terrifying calm, reminding her he has not even put an offer on the table yet. Suddenly, the tires scream against the asphalt. The sedan jerks to a perfect stop right in front of her house, an address she never gave him. The lens catches the exact second her reality shatters. It is a psychological hammer blow. As she stumbles out onto the cold pavement on shaking legs, she throws out one last plea to be left alone. The hard lesson we have to take away from this is clear. You cannot negotiate with someone who sees you as a possession. They do not do compromises. They only orchestrate your ruin. He leaves her with a vow that chills the blood. He swears he will not cross a single line until she actually begs him to do it. His absolute certainty is the scariest part. She tries to write him off as crazy, but that toxic seed is already in the dirt. As the red taillights vanish down the street, the camera watches her endure a brutal, sleepless night. Every shadow on the wall feels like a threat closing in. When the sun finally comes up, her exhausted mind tries to pretend it was all just a bad dream. Then she opens her front door. A massive arrangement of dark red roses sits there like a tombstone, marking the beginning of a psychological siege. It brings up a painful truth for anyone watching. Huge, extravagant gestures from a stranger are not romance. They are a weapon to test your fences and tear down your safety. There is no card hidden in those flowers. That is not a mistake. It is a deliberate move to make sure his invisible presence fills the entire room. She drags the heavy arrangement inside, completely weighed down by dread. Then her phone lights up. A text from an unknown number arrives, casually mentioning the exact clothes she is wearing right now. He is out there watching her. She immediately blocks the number, but that is useless against a man who sees boundaries as a starting pistol. The deliveries start multiplying, masking a total psychological takeover as old-fashioned courtship. Her roommate sighs over the romance of it all, dismissing the absolute terror. We have to learn this lesson early in life. Someone who constantly steps over your clearly drawn lines is not deeply in love with you. They are just proving they have power over you. She decides to hide her panic from her roommate. It is a beautifully tragic misstep. Isolation is the exact oxygen a captor needs to start a fire. 2 weeks go by, and the pressure only builds. A vintage copy of Sicilian poetry shows up at the house. The note attached is pure arrogance, literally telling her how she feels and claiming she is just pretending not to be obsessed with him. She holds out for 3 brutal days before she finally caves. The lens finds her awake at 2 in the morning, reading verses he specifically picked to manufacture a fake soulmate connection. Next comes a rare book she only mentioned in passing years ago. A surgical hit to her sanity. Here is the lesson we cannot ignore. Locking your deepest fears, alone in the dark, only gives your personal demons a quiet, safe place to grow teeth. The realization that he went digging through her past snaps her final nerve. That deep sense of violation sparks a total emotional explosion, burning away any logical thought. Running entirely on blind anger, she walks right into his exclusive restaurant and demands to see him. You and I need to stop and look at this moment, because a predator like him never leaves a single piece on the board to chance. A massive enforcer materializes from the dark. He speaks softly, but the threat of violence practically rolls off his shoulders. He walks her right past the rich, clueless diners. She actually thinks she is making a brave, heroic stand, completely missing that she is locking herself in his cage. It is a tough lesson for anyone. If you let temporary anger drive your actions, you will walk right into the trap your enemy built for you. The shot follows her past walls of stolen art and deep into a heavily guarded back room. 6 hardened men sit around a massive wooden table. The absolute second she steps inside, the air gets sucked out of the room. Kyle sits at the head of it all, slowly turning a glass of dark red wine. His face gives nothing away. Without even blinking or taking his eyes off her, he tells his men to leave. An older guy tries to argue, but Kyle's heavy, suffocating authority just flattens the entire room. The crew walks out, and the heavy door clicks shut behind them. He smiles this dark, knowing smile and whispers that he never actually expected her to deliver herself to him. It is a brutal thing to learn in this life. We always think we are smart enough to outplay the bad guy, but standing that close to fire will burn you before you can even blink. She stands there stiff as a board, hands shaking while she demands he stop sending the gifts. Kyle just looks right through her. His answer is a slow, quiet refusal. No. She angrily accuses him of playing sick games, missing the tragic reality that he views every human being as a completely disposable asset. He stands up with a terrifying, smooth grace, freely admitting he has been studying her. He steps into her personal space, using his sheer physical presence to short-circuit her brain. Her gut is begging her to run, but the heavy gravity of the situation is pulling her down. Her voice cracks. She begs him to stop. He just twists his obsession into a dark, romantic fate. The lesson here is grim. Real danger does not usually drag you kicking and screaming. It messes with your head until you walk in and lock the door yourself. She throws up denial like a brick wall, swearing she feels absolutely nothing for him. With terrifying precision, Kyle starts dismantling her reality, piece by piece. He talks about the armed thug from the restaurant, like it was just a polite invitation, completely normalizing the madness of his violent life. Then he promises that she is safe with him. It is pure, textbook psychological manipulation, forcing her to look for safety in the exact person causing her terror. When she asks what he actually wants, he feeds her ego with a confession of deep obsession, effectively chaining her mind. He even blames her for speaking to him in his native tongue on their first meeting, making his madness her fault. It is a bitter lesson to swallow. The exact moment you decide to dance with a toxic person, you paint a permanent mark hard on your own back for them to aim at. She tries to find her footing, but he does not give her an inch to breathe. He whispers that she made herself visible to him, wrapping a heavy threat inside what sounds like a vulnerable confession. He openly admits he can be cruel. He uses that fake honesty as a weapon to slip right past her emotional walls. Just being seen with him has now made her a target to his enemies. You and I can clearly see the trap closing. He makes himself the ultimate danger and her only shield. When she begs him to stop the flowers, he flatly refuses. As she turns and runs, he calls out that she knows where to find him when she stops lying to herself. He is planting the seed that they are meant to be. The life lesson here is mandatory. When a destructive person shows you their true face, believe them the first time. There is no love hiding in a predator's eyes. 3 full days go by in total silence. It is just enough time for the poison to settle in before the violence breaks out. She walks into the cold, echoing shadows of a concrete parking garage. 2 heavy men step out from behind a pillar. Pure panic spikes in her chest. She tightens her grip on her car keys, ready to fight for her life. Then the taller guy smiles and quietly drops Kyle's name. Her stomach hits the floor. The terrible prophecy he made is actually happening. She fights back like a trapped animal, hitting one guy hard in the jaw and making a break for the stairs. She barely gets 10 feet before a heavy hand grabs her coat. Her screams just bounce off the empty concrete. It is a terrifying reality of the world we live in. A truly toxic person will happily let the wolves chase you, just so they can kick down the door and play the role of your absolute hero. A rough hand covers her mouth just as the heavy garage lights suddenly shut off. That sudden, terrifying darkness is the perfect setup for a deep psychological break. Slow, heavy footsteps start echoing against the cement. What happens next is a masterclass in extreme, calculated violence. A heavy crash, a wet thud, a man screaming into the dark. When the fluorescent lights finally buzz back on, Kyle is standing there looking like the Grim Reaper. One attacker is out cold on the floor. The other is on his knees, with Kyle's weapon pressed tight to his head. Kyle just stares right at her, looking at her ripped coat. Her exhausted brain actually looks at this horrific violence and mistakes it for absolute safety. It is a dark truth about human nature. When the devil himself is the one who steps up to save your life, the bill never goes away. It just collects interest. The tension here is suffocating. Serena stands frozen as Kyle flips a terrifying emotional switch. In a heartbeat, his face morphs from murderous rage into an empty, chilling calm. He presses his weapon to the attacker's skull, extracts the name Salvatore Viscari, and casually watches his men drag the body into the shadows. Heavy silence floods the garage. Then, Kyle turns to Serena, moving with the fluid grace of a predator cornering a deer. She begs to go home. Instead, his dark pathology takes the wheel. He strips away her agency entirely, claiming her apartment is compromised and locking her inside his web. It brings us to a real-life lesson. We often think hiding behind someone strong will keep us safe, but true security never comes from handing your freedom over to a man who feeds on absolute control. Let us look at this moment together. The pale light catches Kyle's scarred knuckles as he slowly offers his hand. Every instinct in Serena's body is screaming at her to run, but a bone-deep exhaustion completely hijacks her rational mind. In a tragic early sign of trauma bonding, she reaches for comfort from the exact monster who just endangered her life. Her shaking fingers finally meet his palm. Soon, he drives her to a heavily fortified estate. The camera lingers on towering stone walls and thick iron gates, mirroring the psychological cage he is already building. As those heavy metal doors slam shut with a sickening thud, the grim reality sets in. Here is a truth we all need to remember. Pure exhaustion often wears the mask of consent, quietly pushing us to cross boundaries that we can never uncross. This massive estate is a masterclass in psychological intimidation. The manor reeks of extreme wealth and quiet surveillance, establishing Kyle as the god of this domain. When Serena questions her captivity, he gently strokes her knuckles, a calculated move to breed physical dependency. He feeds her the old lie that this isolation is strictly for her protection. Inside, his staff anticipates her every need, stripping away her independence. As he guides her down the halls, his obsessive possession is disguised as gentle care. The sheer opulence of the cold marble is weaponized to overwhelm her exhausted mind. The lesson here hits hard. Wealth and luxury are often used as beautiful gilded cages, designed specifically to make someone blind to the fact that they are caught in a trap. Beneath the wealth, you find the quiet markers of a predator, the faint scent of heavy tobacco, a discarded jacket. Leading her past dark portraits, Kyle asserts absolute dominance. He leaves her in a massive guest room without any timeline for release. When she pushes back, he immediately weaponizes the outside threat of Viscari to justify his control. Serena desperately tries to anchor herself, logically stating she means absolutely nothing to him. His response is a chilling violation. He steps close, tracing her jawline to stake a physical claim. His dismissal of her logic reveals a dark truth about obsession. To the fixated mind, the victim's feelings simply do not matter. It leaves us with a stark life lesson. You can never use logic to reason your way out of someone else's dangerous delusion. Step into this room with me and watch the exact moment the air goes completely dead. The sudden interruption makes Kyle Hess' simulated warmth vanish, replaced by the flat stare of a killer. The camera lingers on Serena, capturing her agonizing cognitive dissonance. Logic screams that she should want this man to suffer. Yet, watching him embrace his brutal nature sends a sickening panic through her chest. He orders her to rest, dressing up his absolute control as tender care. He justifies his violence by claiming he goes out to spill blood in her name. Shockingly, his cold certainty does not make her run. It gives her a twisted sense of safety. It teaches us a very harsh truth about survival. Seeking shelter in the dark shadows of a monster will only ever guarantee your own eventual destruction. The camera slowly pans across her beautiful, terrible cage. These quarters are built to pacify her, using extreme luxury to overwhelm her nervous system. She steps into the shower, frantically scrubbing her skin to wash away the physical memory of the assault, standing until the water runs freezing cold. Stepping out, she finds fresh clothes tailored exactly to her measurements. It is a clinically terrifying detail, proving Kyle mapped her dimensions long before the abduction. Serena pushes this dark reality down, plunging into deep denial. She whispers that she will leave at dawn, a tragic lie her own mind already rejects. It brings us to a deeply unsettling realization. Extreme comfort is frequently the most effective weapon used to silently crush our natural human instinct to escape. Waking up in a nightmare is always the cruelest part. The camera catches that brief amnesia in Serena's eyes before reality crashes down. Her phone lights up with frantic messages from her friend Maya. This is the true tragedy of psychological captivity. Serena helps build her own cage, typing a lie that severs her only lifeline to the outside world. In the kitchen, she finds Kyle playing house. He pours coffee, a calculated domestic performance masking the monster underneath. But the lens focuses on his freshly split knuckles. Serena actively looks away, choosing willful blindness. When she asks about the previous night, his flat dismissal of human life chills the blood. We learn a vital lesson here. When we actively lie to cover up the darkness surrounding us, we become the silent architects of our own prison. Look closely at the tension building here. Kyle casually explains a brutal territorial dispute, painting Serena as a pawn in his violent chess match. His rival correctly identified her as his singular vulnerability. When Serena challenges this irrational obsession, Kyle reveals the freezing mindset of a true narcissist. His fixation needs no logical foundation. It exists purely as absolute law. Serena is tearing herself apart inside. Her rational mind begs her to dismiss his possessive behavior as mere adrenaline. But the trauma bond is already rewiring her emotional circuits, forging a dark, addictive tension every time their eyes lock. We must understand a vital truth. The greatest danger is rarely the physical threat itself, but rather our brain's terrifying capacity to eventually romanticize the exact thing that traps us. The camera tightens as Serena makes one desperate push to reclaim her life, demanding to go home. Kyle smoothly counters with a 3-day timeline. It is a psychological trick designed to pacify a captive with a false horizon. When she rejects his terms, his twisted control crystallizes. He instantly revokes her choices. Serena calls it exactly what it is: kidnapping. But Kyle uses extreme rationalization, rebranding his imprisonment as necessary protection. He uses physical proximity to dominate her while speaking in dangerously soft tones. He shifts all the blame onto his rival, washing his hands of any guilt. The lesson here is deeply tragic. When someone strips away your freedom under the guise of keeping you safe, they are not your protector. They have simply become your new warden. Look at the visual framing here. The psychological trap snaps shut with agonizing precision. Kyle dictates that she is staying, claiming he is the only one who can keep her safe. He engineers an isolation so absolute that he becomes her only emotional anchor. Serena visibly trembles, fighting to hold on to reality. Then comes the masterstroke, a calculated glimpse of remorse. He whispers that she deserves better. Just as his fingers brush her cheek, an enforcer suddenly shatters the tension. Viscari demands an 8 o'clock meeting. Kyle must come entirely alone. The lighting seems to dim, the air turning heavy with dread. It is an undeniable, fatal setup. The lesson here is terribly harsh. In a dark world ruled by apex predators, a single second of misplaced trust will always cost you your life. The camera pushes in slowly on Kyle. The lighting is stark and cold, matching the freezing detachment in his eyes, as he casually orders sniper coverage for an obvious ambush. To him, extreme violence is just a simple math problem. But look at Serena in the background. Her hands are visibly shaking. She begs him not to walk into a trap, tethered to an empathy he simply does not possess. He takes a slow sip of his coffee, quietly testing her. He asks if his death would actually bother her. She desperately wants to lie, to build a solid emotional wall against this ruthless man, but the raw trembling in her voice entirely betrays her. The devastating life lesson here is clear. Normal human morality is incredibly fragile when pulled directly into the heavy orbit of absolute, unbending conviction. Let us hit pause on this exact frame. You and I are watching the precise moment a woman completely surrenders her survival instincts. Serena whispers that his death would bother her, foolishly believing her honesty is a defiant stand. Kyle merely tilts his head, studying her with the intensity of a starving wolf cornering a lamb. He reaches out, his thumb tracing her jawline, and promises he is not done with her. After he leaves her alone in the shadowy mansion, the camera follows her aimless wandering. Her fingertips brush across grand pianos and heavy books. She is literally measuring the drapes of her own tragic cage. It is a very bitter truth to face in life. The absolute hardest prison to break out of is the one where you fall hopelessly in love with the man holding the keys. Let us look closely at the psychology of her surrender. Any rational mind trapped inside the walls of a crime syndicate would be shattering glass and fighting for an exit. Instead, Serena simply rattles the heavy oak door, exhales a defeated breath, and lets her arms fall dead. This is the chilling apathy that takes root when the human spirit stops fighting its cage. The camera cuts to the foggy estate gardens, framing her tiny figure beneath the suffocating shadow of a stone angel. She sits freezing in the mist, consumed by the violent mafia boss who stole her freedom. It is a haunting visual. We often willingly burn down our own sanctuary just to keep a broken person warm. And right there, watching her with the unblinking eyes of a predator, stands Maria. Maria enters the frame, the sharp, metallic snap of her pruning shears, cutting through the silence like a ticking time bomb. For a woman deeply embedded in a mafia family, her calmness is deeply unsettling. She speaks smoothly, assuming Serena is the newest girlfriend. When Maria casually mentions that Kyle's late mother planted these exact roses before cancer claimed her, the emotional atmosphere flips instantly. In a single cinematic breath, the harsh lighting softens. To Serena, Kyle suddenly morphs from a ruthless cartel killer into a wounded 12-year-old boy crying out for his mother. The underlying psychological horror here is profoundly human. Our minds will eagerly paint a terrifying predator as a helpless victim, simply because feeling pity is much easier than living in fear. Notice exactly how the director frames this psychological manipulation. Maria uses a soft tone, tricking the audience into believing this garden stroll is a tender moment. But then the trap closes. Leaning in, Maria drops her voice to a lethal whisper, warning Serena that while Kyle might possess some kindness, he is a violently dangerous man. She explicitly tells the girl to run for her life, yet the camera refuses to let us look away from Serena, who stands utterly frozen. She stares blankly at the sharp rose thorns, too terrified to even test the bars of her invisible prison. It is a cinematic punch to the gut. The harsh reality we must confront is that the longer you sit around making excuses for someone else's toxic behavior, the heavier your own chains become. Maria spells out the tragedy, warning that the criminal underworld leaves scars that never fade. The scene dissolves into night as Kyle vanishes into the dark with armed enforcers. What follows is a masterful study of anxiety. The camera anchors onto Serena as she paces the floors for hours, checking the clock like a devoted wife. Finally, at 1:30 in the morning, Kyle steps into the dim foyer, his shirt absolutely drenched in the fresh blood of a rival. Any healthy instinct would scream at her to flee, yet Serena drops her shoulders in a wave of exhausted relief. It is deeply disturbing to watch. Trauma his shirt. Trauma will so thoroughly your reality that you find yourself running for safety straight into the jaws of the very monster you should be escaping. The framing of this agonizing moment is brilliant. Serena stands inches from a man, radiating the harsh stench of fresh violence and gunpowder. Breathing heavily, he confesses to butchering his rival, Viscari, for one terrifying reason. The man dared to put his hands on her. Kyle's eyes are a chaotic storm of possessive rage and twisted affection. He whispers that she should be sickened by the sight of him, offering a fake escape hatch. He knows exactly how tightly she is leashed. By all logic, she should bolt for the door. Instead, she slowly closes the distance, pressing her face against the chest of a confessed killer. The brutal truth of human nature is that we will sometimes embrace the most toxic, suffocating love imaginable, simply because we are terrified of being alone. Look closely at this exact sequence with me. We are watching the precise second a soul binds itself to the darkness. Starved for warmth, Kyle drops his rigid mafia posture and pulls Serena into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair like a drowning man, grasping a lifeline. Surrounded by the heavy scent of dead roses and fresh violence, Serena seals her doom. She anchors herself to a predator who slaughters to protect his belongings. But the moment he steps back to wash the blood from his skin, raw panic floods her features. She begs him to stay, but he coldly commands her to wait. The harsh lesson here is undeniable. People will blind themselves to the most dangerous red flags, as long as the person holding them promises to fill the empty void in their chest. The camera captures a deeply unsettling detail. Before walking away, he gives her hip a firm tap. It is a physical anchor designed to keep her psychologically chained. 40 minutes later, he summons her into the freezing estate library. The blood is gone, but he drops a devastating bomb. He is engaged to the daughter of Don Vittorio, the apex predator of the crime family. He delivers this nightmare without a trace of emotion. Then comes his masterstroke of manipulation. He declares he will shatter a massive syndicate peace treaty, heavily implying it is entirely her fault. You can see the guilt physically crush her shoulders. The reality we must learn is this: never carry the blame when a toxic person burns their own life down. They always wanted the fire, they just needed you to hold the match. The psychological tension rapidly hits a boiling point. Kyle amplifies the emotional torture, framing this broken mafia engagement as an absolute declaration of war. Watch Serena's body language closely. She practically folds into herself, crying out that she is just an ordinary girl caught in the crossfire. In response, Kyle deploys his heaviest weapon. He steps into her space, his towering shadow swallowing hers, and drops the word love. He praises her trauma response, twisting her frozen fear from their first meeting into a sign of strength. It is cinematic love bombing at its darkest. Life offers a very harsh truth in moments like this. True monsters do not fall in love. They simply scan your soul, locate your deepest vulnerability, and forge a custom cage to trap it perfectly. The dialogue here is the poetry of the damned. He paints vivid pictures, whispering about planting a quiet rose garden just to watch her smile. It is a spectacular lie, constructed to mask his killer instincts. When a tear escapes down her cheek, he wipes it away. The camera frames this not as comfort, but as an act of physical dominance. He swears that losing her would be worse than fighting a cartel war. And right there, Serena breaks. She confesses that while his violence disgusts her, she feels incredibly safe, hiding within his shadow. This brings us to a painful reality. A broken mind will fiercely cling to the very poison destroying it, as long as that poison acts as a shield against the rest of the world. He presses his forehead to hers, locking the door to their ruin. The final shot is a cinematic masterpiece of fatalism. They silently agree to drive their lives off a psychological cliff. Then comes the kiss. The director strips away any illusion of romance. It is a raw, aggressive act of territorial claiming. The heavy lighting makes the moment feel like pure adrenaline, pushing them across a boundary they can never uncross. When he tells her to stay the night, his commanding tone leaves absolutely no room for debate. It is a binding contract with no escape clause. Serena willingly throws her safe life into the fire for a maniac who treats her like a prized trophy. It is gutting to watch as the screen fades to black. Here is the vital lesson to carry with you. Never let your deep desperation to be valued cause you to mistake predatory obsession for genuine love. The camera trails Serena as she drifts down a corridor lined with the painted eyes of dead cartel warlords. It is a museum of sociopaths leading straight to his bed. Serena, who spent her life outrunning danger, willingly erases her identity for him. But morning always comes and the harsh daylight strips away the fantasy. Her bruised lips are physical evidence of her surrendered power. Yet, the second he pulls her against his chest, her logic dissolves. He asks if she regrets it, a cruel psychological test to verify his control. They lie there, pretending the outside world is gone, until a vibrating phone shatters the illusion. The lesson here is absolute. You can lock the heavy doors and pull the curtains, but you can never hide from the brutal consequences of your own choices. He finally answers the call, and the mask of the gentle lover melts away. Stick with me here, because this is where the carefully constructed lie completely falls apart. We watch the warmth drain from his face, his eyes hardening into lethal ice. The Bellicaro family knows the engagement is broken, and Don Vittorio demands an immediate meeting. For the very first time, raw panic flashes across Kyle's face, and Serena sees every terrible second of it. He tells her plainly that choosing her has painted a massive target on her back. Sheer terror takes hold of her, her chest heaving as her breathing spirals out of control. She is entirely trapped in his gilded cage. The truth is bitter and unforgiving. You can never build a safe, peaceful life on top of someone else's dangerous secrets. Kyle tells her to stay locked in the compound, playing that old trick of calling a cage a safe house. He genuinely thinks he can walk into a mafia boss's lair and walk out breathing. He grabs her face, making a desperate promise to fix a world that is already entirely broken, kissing her like he is trying to brand her skin before he goes. The camera lingers on Serena as she watches him put on his imaginary armor. In that suffocating silence, something inside her fractures, for good. She finally sees the writing on the wall. The hard truth of life is that ignoring the warning signs never makes them go away. It just lets them wrap tighter around your own throat. She paces the cold stone floor, trapped by her reliance on a man who just marched willingly into his own grave. By the time the sun finally drops, her nerves are completely shot. She stands frozen by the glass, begging the universe to send him back. But the heavy headlights tearing up the driveway do not belong to Kyle. 6 black sedans smash through the iron gates. Let us watch this disaster unfold together. This is the precise moment his blind arrogance burns everything down. A guard grabs her arm, screaming a warning right as the chaos erupts. Gunshots shatter the night, and glass rains down on them. Serena drops to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest as men die in the dark around her. Then comes an agonizing silence, broken only by the slow click of dress shoes on marble. Don Vittorio steps inside, as cold as a grave. Life teaches us that arrogant pride will always invite your own ruin. The camera shifts to reveal a completely different kind of monster. Don Vittorio stares down at her like she is a crushed insect on his shoe. A freezing smile touches his mouth as he wonders aloud if Kyle is truly willing to bleed for her. With his silver hair and neat suit, he looks like a gentle grandfather. That is just a mask hiding 40 years of brutality. The visual contrast is sickening. The pristine white marble is painted crimson, and a loyal guard lies dead, just feet away. Serena goes entirely blank, her mind shutting down to survive the shock of the slaughter. The simplest life lesson you will ever learn is that monsters rarely look scary in the light of day. They usually look exactly like the nicest person in the room. Listen to the absolute disgust dripping from Vittorio's voice when he commands her to stand. He is flanked by young thugs with dead eyes, men whose humanity was hollowed out by the crime family years ago. The old man circles Serena slowly, treating her like cheap meat on a butcher block, openly mocking her trembling hands and terrified face. But here is the detail that truly fuels his rage. He cannot fathom how a nobody ruined his grand design. To this man, his own daughter is just a chess piece, bred entirely to secure a massive business merger. His cold brain cannot compute that Kyle chose actual feelings over a shiny mob princess. It is a heavy truth to carry. When you treat people like property, you will never understand the undeniable power of real human connection. The hatred radiating from this man physically suffocates the room. Pinned against the wall, Serena frantically stammers that she only survived by cursing at Kyle in his native tongue, a rebellious spark he loved. Vittorio just lets out a hollow, bone-chilling laugh. He coldly states that marriage is nothing but a business transaction. His heavy hand clamps onto her jaw so violently that dark bruises instantly bloom under her skin. He is not mourning his daughter's broken heart. He is merely embarrassed. 3 years of planning have been destroyed, leaving him looking weak. In his twisted reality, a public insult requires a body bag. He whispers that she will be his bloody message. The lesson here is grim. Sometimes the most devastating violence is born from a fragile, wounded ego. With a single, silent nod, the illusion of choice is violently ripped away. Her primal survival instinct takes over, and she bolts. But her fragile frame is useless against trained killers. A massive enforcer snatches her out of the air like a discarded rag doll. She kicks and screams, until Vittorio blandly orders them to gag her because her voice offends him. A rough cloth is shoved into her mouth as they drag her out. Through the shattered doorframes, the camera catches Maria, the housekeeper, frozen in absolute terror. Her hands shake, a woman entirely broken by years of looking the other way. They throw Serena into a heavy van smelling of expensive leather and fresh gunpowder. The sad truth remains. Staying silent around evil eventually makes you a prisoner to it. The coarse fabric of the gag tears at her mouth, and thick zip ties bite so deeply that her fingers turn numb. Vittorio slides into the front seat, calmly lighting a cigarette while leaving the dead behind like rubbish. He orders the driver to Kyle's old warehouse, a deeply poetic location for a murder. You and I are watching a textbook narcissist direct a theatrical tragedy right before our eyes. It is all about marking territory. The thug beside Serena casually scrolls on his phone while she suffocates in her own panic. She knows the true horror here. Kyle has absolutely no idea she has been taken. The dark stretches for 20 agonizing minutes into a desolate wasteland. A tough pill to swallow is that sometimes pure isolation is the silent weapon that destroys you first. The cars idle outside a decaying structure, choked with rust and shattered windows. Vittorio steps out, stretching his spine as if arriving at a luxury resort rather than a slaughterhouse. He orders his men to drag her into the gloom and call Kyle, demanding he arrive entirely alone. They pull her into a suffocatingly dark room. A few cheap fluorescent bulbs hum to life, revealing a single steel chair bolted to the cracked concrete. Serena's heart drops. The floor beneath the chair is painted black with layers of old blood. They strap her wrists and chest down so tightly, she can barely draw a shallow breath. When they finally rip the gag free, she gasps, her throat burning and raw. Life rule number 1, never walk blindly into the dark, just because someone told you it was safe. Vittorio drags over a rusted folding chair, crossing his legs as if settling in for an espresso. In a dead voice, He asks if she knows the dark history of this room. She weakly shakes her head. He explains that a man named Viscari was tortured and executed right where she sits, by Kyle, exactly 3 days ago. A sickeningly thin smile creeps across Vittorio's face. He savors the tragic irony that Kyle murdered for her in this room, and now she will bleed here because of him. Then, he lays the ultimate trap. If she wants to survive, she must look Kyle in the eyes, declare she never loved him, and break his spirit so completely that he returns to Isabella. The bitter lesson here is clear. Highly manipulative people will always force you to pull the trigger on your own happiness. Not a single muscle twitches as Vittorio lays out the alternative. If she refuses, he will force Kyle to watch them slowly torture her to death. That threat slams into her chest like a stone. She cries out that he is insane, but he calls it a practical business move. It is the perfect psychological snare. Destroy her own heart, or die horribly while destroying his soul. He rises slowly, dusting off his suit, giving her 30 minutes to decide before Kyle arrives. He vanishes into the shadows. Serena has been counting every frantic heartbeat since they took her. She knows she does not have 30 minutes. She only has 18. The most terrifying truth of all? Time is the one thing you can never negotiate with, no matter how much you beg. The roar of a heavy engine shatters the silence and followed by the dull thud of a car door. Kyle steps into the grim lighting, completely alone. Serena watches him, and you can practically see her heart shatter. It is the tragic irony of her existence, finding comfort in the hands of a violent man. He is dressed in stark black, radiating destruction. But the second his eyes meet hers, his armor cracks. He breathes her name, losing his icy grip. Suddenly, Vittorio steps from the shadows, slow clapping. Kyle instantly offers to surrender to the arranged marriage, just to buy her safety. Vittorio only offers a cruel smile. It teaches us a real truth about sacrifice. True love is not about grand gestures. It is about handing your worst enemy the knife to keep someone else breathing. Vittorio treats Serena like a mere prop in his twisted play. Kyle steps forward, and instantly every gun in the room locks onto his chest. He threatens to ruin Vittorio's bloodline, but the old man simply draws a silver pistol. He is a pure narcissist, starving for total submission. He commands Kyle to kneel, accept the marriage, and pay a $10 million fine. Kyle does not even blink. He accepts every condition, dropping heavily into a puddle of blood on the concrete. Serena begs him to stop, her voice cracking in pure horror as she watches the deadliest man she knows throw away his power for her. It leaves us with a profound realization. The strongest people in your life are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones who will willingly drop into the dirt so you can keep standing. Vittorio refuses to stop turning the psychological screws. He forces Kyle to beg. Kyle offers his fortune, his empire, and his life to buy Serena's freedom. Beside him, Serena weeps, her spirit shattered. Vittorio steps up, pressing the cold steel of his gun against Kyle's skull, taunting him about how love turns strong men weak. He pulls the trigger. A hollow click cuts the silence. Kyle doesn't blink. His eyes are pitch black. Chuckling, the old boss points his gun at Serena, calling her a loose end. That is the exact moment Kyle erupts from the floor, just as smoke grenades shatter the windows and flood the room. It reveals a profound truth about human nature. Those who mock grabbed his shirt. Those the devotion of others are usually too arrogant to see the fatal danger standing right in front of them. Stick with me here, because this is where the entire power dynamic violently flips. Through the heavy smoke, familiar hands grab Serena. It is Kyle, slicing her bonds and navigating the crossfire like a predator in the pitch dark. He drags her behind an armored car. Shaking, she stammers that he promised to come alone. Kyle flashes a terrifying, hollow smile and admits he lied. Why on earth would he walk blindly into a slaughter? He fades back into the choking fog, and his crew executes a brutally precise takedown. Minutes later, the gunfire dies down. Kyle emerges from the haze dripping with blood, dragging a broken Vittorio by the collar and dropping him at her feet. This leaves us with a stark life lesson. Never mistake someone's willingness to endure suffering for an inability to completely destroy you. Watch how the camera captures this brutal reversal. The old boss chokes on his own blood, yet still attempts to play his toxic mind games. Kyle shuts him down by driving the man's face into the concrete, purposefully leaving him alive. The worst punishment you can inflict on a narcissist is making them survive public humiliation. Kyle orders his crew to drag the mobster away as a warning. Then, instantly, the cold killer dissolves into a desperate, trembling man. He crushes Serena to his chest, his apologies spilling out in a frantic rush as his armored exterior completely shatters. She simply holds him, whispering that he kept her alive. This teaches us a difficult life lesson. Sometimes, the exact person who brings the most chaos into your world is the only one who can make you feel entirely safe. They stand anchored to each other in a room buried under shell casings and devastation. Kyle issues a harsh warning that rings out like a dark promise. He tells her that life by his side means endless paranoia and sudden violence. A rational person would run. But the lens lingers right here, capturing a deep trauma bond snapping into place. Serena does not see a monster. She sees the shield that kept her breathing. The danger does not repel her. It draws her closer. As she actively chooses this dark reality, a wave of desperate relief washes over Kyle's face. They share a kiss that tastes like copper and pure survival. This brings us to an uncomfortable life lesson. Shared trauma does not just break people down. It fuses them together in complicated ways that simple logic can never untangle. You and I know this choice carries a heavy price tag. Kyle severs his ties with the rival syndicate, permanently calling off his arranged marriage. When Serena asks how they will survive the incoming street war, his icy calmness is unsettling. He simply states they will win. The tense drive back to his estate plays out like a masterclass in deep paranoia. He swaps vehicles and takes long detours to shake off invisible shadows. Serena, drained by the heavy adrenaline crash, slumps against his shoulder. As dawn breaks over his compound, the toll of his criminal empire is undeniable. The beautiful architecture is ruined by fresh bullet holes. It leaves us with a hard life lesson. Your physical environment will always eventually reflect your internal chaos, no matter how much money you spend trying to hide the damage. Let us look closely at the quiet aftermath. Kyle's crew works to scrub the blood from the floorboards, erasing the night's sins. He leads Serena behind thick iron gates, locking them inside a safe room. In this isolated space, his untouchable boss persona completely collapses. He examines her face with a shaking terror, painfully aware of how close he came to burying her. He confesses that his own blinding ego almost got her murdered. As his mind spirals into anxiety over future attacks, Serena firmly grabs his hands, pulling him back to reality. She acknowledges the absolute nightmare they are standing in, yet she refuses to leave. This leaves us with a powerful life lesson. Genuine loyalty is never about ignoring the danger. It is about staring directly at the worst possible outcome and making the hard choice to stay anyway. In this bleak story, intimacy acts as their only survival mechanism. The camera tracks their hands checking each other for wounds, documenting the night's brutal toll. Kyle breaks down, confessing he has zero control over his obsession. Serena feels that exact same magnetic pull, knowing her presence is dismantling his syndicate. Psychologically, she justifies this by anchoring her self-worth to his capacity for extreme violence. If a man will burn a city to ash for her, she feels deeply valued. Outside, the heavy thud of hammers boarding up windows ticks like a doomsday clock. This brings us a tragic life lesson. Tying your personal worth to the amount of destruction someone will cause for you is a fatal game. When violence becomes your love language, the only guarantee is that someone will bleed. Serena sleeps for 8 solid hours, her nervous system finally crashing under the weight of her trauma. When she wakes, the giant bed is empty, and the space is deeply disorienting. Soon, violent shouting bleeds up through the hardwood floors. She throws on an oversized shirt and creeps to the staircase. We need to pay close attention to the argument below. A loyal lieutenant screams at Kyle, warning him that shooting the old Don was tactical suicide. The rival family will demand heavy bloodshed. But Kyle is blind to reason now. He snaps back that the bullet was a necessary message. He is willingly burning a 3-year peace treaty to ash to keep her. This points to a devastating life lesson. When pure obsession takes the steering wheel, logic vanishes, and you will gladly crash your own life to prove a point. The tension snaps when a lieutenant tells Kyle he is acting like a feral animal rather than a boss. Challenged, Kyle instantly defaults to the only language he respects: pure violence. He steps close, threatening to hurl the man through the glass window if he breathes another word. The room drops into dead silence. From the shadows of the stairs, Serena watches 5 hardened enforcers, struggling to contain the unpredictable monster they call their leader. The oldest man tries a softer approach, asking if they will pay for this mess with cash or blood. Kyle looks him dead in the eye and swears he will gladly burn his own empire to the ground to protect her. Here is a bitter life lesson about true power. Money and influence mean absolutely nothing if you are enslaved by your own unchecked emotions. Picture the suffocating shadows of the study. We are watching a man dismantle his family's legacy. Kyle stands rigid, rejecting everything his father built and refusing the marriage designed to buy peace. His men try a softer approach. They murmur respect but point out the brutal truth. Serena is an outsider, and risking hundreds of loyal men for a fleeting romance is madness. Kyle turns his back, shutting them down. As the defeated men file out, the oldest enforcer pauses. He turns his weathered face and locks eyes with Serena. His expression is a devastating mix of deep pity and sheer disgust. It teaches us a tough life lesson. You might believe you are the star of an epic romance, but to the people bleeding for your choices, you are just the disaster that ruined everything. Let's pause and really look at this quiet disaster. The oak door clicks shut, leaving a deafening silence. It is just Serena and Kyle now. Watch how the shadows cling to his rigid posture. With his hands buried in his pockets and his jaw clamped tight, we see the physical weight of a man totally losing his grip on reality. He is begging her with his exhausted eyes to validate his madness. He desperately needs her to say he is not crazy for burning down a criminal empire for her sake. Across the room, Sarah stands paralyzed, terrified that she is just his shiny new obsession. Here is the vital life lesson hiding in this tragedy. The very second you start worrying about a toxic person's emotional pain, more than your own physical survival, the psychological trap has already snapped shut. Listen to the ragged edge of Kyle's voice. He describes the fear of losing her as if he is physically drowning. It is a raw panic, proving she has become his only source of oxygen. When Serena whispers that she will stand by his choice, her voice fractures. That tiny tremor marks the tragic birth of total dependency. She is tying her survival to the exact man who painted a target on her back. Notice how they desperately clutch each other. Outside, his entire army is gearing up for a slaughter, but the lovers are completely blinded by obsession. His grand plan is pure madness. This leaves us with an undeniable life lesson. Arrogance will always convince you that you can rewrite the rules of a brutal world, but in reality, it usually just drags everyone you love straight into the grave. Serena knows she is walking into a butcher shop. Her instincts never lie. Yet Kyle paints this suicide mission as a power play, believing the old man will respect raw nerve. It is a fatal miscalculation. Vittorio is a creature of pure ego. He does not honor bravery. He violently crushes defiance. Kyle is dragging her back into her darkest nightmare, forcing her to smell rusted blood again. This reveals a simple life lesson. The anticipation of violence rots your soul much faster than the act itself. Kyle gambles on a public space, hoping the crowd will act as a shield. Serena whispers she is terrified, but her hollow gaze tells the real story. Deep trauma has already burned away her capacity for actual fear. The camera lingers on Serena as she forces a devastating mental reset. The tension in this dim room is suffocating. She is locked inside a fortress of cold steel and loaded weapons. Kyle pulls her close, instructing her to bury every natural human feeling. He makes her stare into the vanity mirror until the raw terror in her eyes hardens into dead ice. It is an agonizing transformation, bringing you and I to a profound, simple life lesson. Sometimes, to survive the worst storms, you must completely extinguish the innocent person you used to be. She is shedding her soft skin purely out of necessity. If she walks through that heavy wooden door showing even a single drop of hesitation, these hungry wolves will tear her apart before she can even blink. A day later, the innocent girl is gone. Notice her dark clothes and that vacant, freezing stare. It is a tragic camouflage designed to hide her in a room of seasoned killers. Kyle watches her with possessive hunger, proving the absolute toxicity of their bond. He offers a quiet exit, knowing perfectly well she is tangled in his web and cannot leave. He pulls her tight against his chest, spiking her adrenaline to guarantee blind loyalty. It is a chilling display of manipulation, leaving us with a simple life lesson. The person pulling your strings will often use affection as a loaded weapon, convincing you to march toward the firing squad with a smile on your face. This is a tragedy dressed as romance, and both of them are dancing blindly into an early grave. Let us sit in the back of this car together, because the atmosphere is practically choking them. They glide past lines of armed guards, and Serena's very bones are screaming at her to run. Her pulse thrashes against her throat, terrified of the rival waiting to butcher them. Yet, watch how she closes her eyes and forces her mind to rebrand this horrific panic as profound love. It is the exact same fatal delusion blinding Vittorio's men, who believe bleeding out for a tyrant is a high honor. This gives us a heartbreaking, simple life lesson. The human mind will construct any beautiful fantasy to avoid confronting a gruesome reality. The black sedan finally idles outside a lavish restaurant, offering a sickening contrast to the bloody slaughter awaiting them inside. The irony of this quiet street is utterly suffocating. The golden lighting of the restaurant looks elegant and peaceful. But watch Serena's eyes as she pieces together the grim reality. She notices the subtle tilt of security lenses, the unnatural bulges under tailored coats, and the eerie absence of normal patrons. Kyle nudges her, a silent command to straighten her spine, and she pulls on a mask of cold dominance to conceal her trembling fingers. They step past Vittorio's elite executioners, notice their flat, entirely dead eyes. These are men who sever human lives without a single flicker of remorse. It brings a chilling simple life lesson into focus. The true monsters of this world do not roar or draw attention to themselves. They stand perfectly still in the quiet shadows, blending seamlessly into the background, waiting to end you the very second you let your guard down. Let us pause and study the geography of this room together. Every shadow is deliberately cast to intimidate. At the head of the mahogany table sits Don Vittorio. His breathing is shallow, his body decaying from a gunshot wound, yet his eyes blaze with malice. Because his physical form is failing, his ego demands he break someone to feel supreme again. He locks his predatory gaze on Serena, targeting the most vulnerable soul to absorb his venom. Kyle remains utterly motionless beside her, refusing to flinch. Vittorio lets out a wretched laugh, coughing up crimson onto his chin. It is a grotesque sight that carries a simple life lesson. Men poisoned by absolute power will gleefully burn the world to ash, clinging violently to their hollow thrones, even as their bodies rot away from the inside out. Listen to Vittorio recite the names of his fallen soldiers. Do not be deceived. He feels zero grief for those lost lives. He is only enraged that his legacy suffered a scratch. He is a dying king throwing a bloody tantrum, eager to watch his empire turn to dust if it guarantees Kyle's agony. Marco pleads for logic, but the old Don amplifies his venom, hurling filthy insults at Serena. You can see the muscles in Kyle's jaw feather, ready to erupt, but Serena slides her trembling hand over his to anchor him. It is a tragic irony. He demands respect for the woman he just marched into an execution chamber. This reveals a harsh, simple life lesson. In a world ruled by blind arrogance, a bruised ego is infinitely more dangerous than a broken heart. Wounded pride is the spark that truly starts wars. Watch the moment this fragile negotiation plummets into the abyss. Marco desperately tries to bridge the gap, sliding offers of wealth across the table. But for a fading tyrant like Vittorio, currency is meaningless. He demands submission. He commands Kyle to fulfill the old arranged marriage, reducing Serena to dirt on his shoes. In response, Kyle aggressively laces his fingers through Serena's in plain view. It is an unforgivable insult to the Don. Kyle keeps pushing logic, offering endless territory, entirely missing the real issue. Vittorio grits his bloody teeth and forces his rotting body to stand. The dreadful silence confirms the meeting is over. The life lesson here is brutal and simple. You can never use logic to negotiate with wounded pride. To a man completely consumed by his own ego, any compromise is just a blade to the chest. The shadows swallow the old man as he delivers his death sentence. He turns his back, dismissing her existence. But right here, the camera pushes in. Serena forces air into her terrified lungs. She confesses she is a nobody, and this brutal honesty actually unbalances the tension. Then, she strikes the ultimate nerve, declaring that Kyle belongs to her, in a way Vittorio never possessed him. The mobster chuckles, mocking the fragile concept of love. Serena does not blink. She tells him his empire is merely cold terror, masquerading as devotion. It is an act of pure, poetic suicide. Watch her trembling hands, and you will learn a vital, simple life lesson. Never underestimate a soul with absolutely nothing left to lose. Strip away their safety, and they will forge your ugly secrets into a blade, driving it straight into your heart. Let us pause the film right here, because you and I are watching a tragic miscalculation unfold. Serena dropped a psychological bomb on Vittorio, exposing how far Kyle will go for her. But she misses the fatal flaw in her script. You never threaten a tyrant who views himself as a god. Watch how the lighting catches Vittorio's face. He flashes a chilling, microscopic smile, revealing the hollow eyes of a predator entirely divorced from morality. With a casual flick of his wrist, he orders her execution like he is asking for a glass of wine. Marco reaches for his weapon, and Kyle immediately throws his body into the direct line of fire. The fragile illusion of diplomacy violently shatters. This brutal sequence leaves us with a bitter, simple life lesson. You can never use human logic to talk a monster out of being a monster once the bloodlust has finally taken over. Picture this scene bursting onto the screen. The alleyway ambush is a masterpiece of suffocating chaos. Gunfire violently tears through the damp night air. Serena experiences a total mental collapse, folding into a terrified crouch, while Kyle drags her over the wet pavement. The air is choked with the sharp scent of gunpowder, a sensory nightmare she will never forget. They burst into the open street, just as their getaway vehicle erupts into a massive fireball. Vittorio's assassins swarm the shadows like wolves. Kyle fights back with the lethal grace of a man raised to deal death, but the tragic math is against him. Too many guns, not enough time. Seeing a bullet tear into Kyle shatters Serena completely. The simple life lesson written in her screaming eyes is devastating. True terror is not merely facing your own death. It is watching your only safe harbor bleed out, right in front of you. Step into the suffocating back seat of this fleeing car with me. We are watching the ugly reality of a trauma bond unfold. Serena is swallowed by panic, pulling Kyle against her. She stares at her shaking hands as warm blood slips through her fingers, screaming that he is dying. Her mind is breaking. But look at Kyle. Even with a bullet inside him, his paranoia runs the show. He refuses a hospital, barking at his driver to head for the estate and find an underground doctor. A quiet truth rises from this terrifying mess. Crisis always burns away our polite masks. It teaches us a difficult lesson. In our most desperate moments, we rarely seek out safety. Instead, we run toward the people who feel familiar, even if they are the exact ones tearing our world apart. The engine roars as the car tears through the dark streets. Serena pushes her weight against his wound, but the bleeding will not stop. In the passing streetlights, Kyle looks like a ghost, already stepping into his grave. She weeps, begging him to keep his eyes open. He reaches up, whispering a weak apology for failing to keep her safe. She snaps back, reminding him he just took a bullet for her. His laugh turns into a sickening cough. Minutes feel like hours before guards finally drag him to Dr. Chen and his waiting surgical tools. It brings up a tragic realization about human nature. When terror takes over, fear completely twists reality. It teaches us how easily we deceive ourselves. We can start believing that the very person who dragged us into a war zone is our only true shelter. Dr. Chen orders everyone out, but the camera stays glued to Serena. She plants her feet on the floorboards, refusing to move. She is fiercely defiant, terrified of losing her only anchor. The surgeon works with cold precision while Kyle floats in pain. When Chen mutters that the boss is lucky the bullet missed his organs, a bitter laugh escapes Serena. Chen notes that luck is relative in their violent world, demanding 6 weeks of bed rest. Kyle blinks awake, his massive pride flaring as he instantly rejects the command. Chen does not flinch, reminding the boss that his criminal crown is worthless if his heart stops beating. It leaves us with a humbling lesson. The humble lesson. All the money and power you gather in life mean absolutely nothing the moment your physical health decides to break down. Driven by a toxic need for control, Kyle tries to force himself out of bed. Blinding pain instantly slams him back into the sheets. Dr. Chen is blunt. Stay flat or tear the stitches and bleed out. Serena grips his shaking hand, her voice cracking as she begs him to stop fighting. The hardened criminal studies her terrified face, swallows his ego, and closes his eyes. Before leaving, the doctor shares a haunting thought. Having known the family for years, he admits he has never seen Kyle look at anyone with such vulnerable obsession. Serena slumps into a chair, numb to the blood drying on her clothes. Her empty stare carries a heavy lesson. When you tie your identity to saving a broken person, you erase yourself. Keeping them breathing becomes your only reason to exist. Serena is shattered. Her fingers clamp around his hand, terrified that if she lets go, he will die. Outside, the sounds of a mob war bleed into the room. Shouting men, roaring engines, the heavy click of weapons. Vittorio has turned a truce into a bloodbath. Crushed by guilt, Serena buries her face against Kyle's burning skin. His eyes snap open, sharp and dangerous, shutting down her tears. In a rough whisper, he swears he knew what claiming her would cost, and he would gladly bleed out to pay that price again. He strokes her hand, soaking in the dark pride that she belongs to him. It leaves us with a chilling lesson. A poisoned mind never runs from destruction. It simply uses the surrounding chaos to justify its dangerous obsessions. Forever mistaking violent control for actual love. Watch the power dynamic invert before our eyes. Kyle promises to end the turf war with a predator's cold confidence. Serena knows it is a lie, but her trauma bond forces her to accept it. For 12 agonizing hours, they are locked in a room heavy with the smell of dried blood. Kyle thrashes in the grip of brutal night terrors, while Serena quietly measures out painkillers. Wiping his burning forehead. When morning breaks, his instinct is to rise and return to the bloodbath. But Serena stuns us. She places her hands firmly on the lethal mobster's chest and forcefully shoves him right back down into the mattress. It brings us to a beautifully tragic truth. Sometimes, the only way to save a destructive soul is to become the one immovable force they simply cannot control. His tactical mind refuses to quit. He hoarsely demands a war council with his men. But Serena steps in front of the door, crossing her arms. She evolves from a terrified hostage into his warden, ordering him to stay in bed. The camera captures a breathtaking shift. The aggressive mob boss actually glitches, his terrifying aura melting into quiet obedience. She leans close. He reaches up, tracing her jawline, like she is the only real thing left on Earth, and confesses his fears. She tries to shoulder the guilt for the bloody ambush, but he sternly silences her. He refuses to let her carry his sins. It all points to a heartbreaking truth about our own psychology. Shared trauma creates a powerful delusion of complete safety, even while your entire world is actively burning to the ground. The shadows deepen as Kyle lays out the brutal math of their situation. Vittorio is consumed with murderous rage, and a massive siege is coming. Then, the killer does something shocking. He offers Serena a forged new identity, begging her to run away from the syndicate. Anyone else would sprint for the door, but her psychological chains are cast in iron. She shoves the papers away, refusing to leave him to face the guns alone. You can watch Kyle's soul fracture on screen. He is torn between the selfish relief of keeping her and the crushing dread that his violent world will ultimately kill her. He pulls her down into a desperate kiss, as if the sky is falling. It leaves us with a heavy, deeply human realization. Love forged under the constant shadow of death will completely erase your natural instinct to survive. Stick with me, because you and I are about to unpack some absolute cinematic madness. Kyle maps out a suicidal chess move. He plans to turn the neutral crime families against Vittorio by marching directly into a Philadelphia mob summit to expose the old man as an unhinged narcissist. The color drains from Serena's face. He is proposing to walk unarmed into a room of predators who would gladly shoot him just to avoid a war. Kyle looks into her terrified eyes and admits the strategy is functionally insane. But his grip tightens on her fingers, swearing it is the final card left in their bloody deck. It all crashes into a terrifying, real-world lesson we can carry with us. Sometimes, the only possible way to defeat an unstoppable monster is to stop running and step willingly into its waiting jaws. Picture this frame with me. As the weight of the summit settles, Kyle blinks first. He pitches a desperate escape, begging to drop the Empire and vanish like ghosts. It is a frantic grasp for control, but watch the camera on Serena. She stares at the dried blood beneath her fingernails and chooses war. She whispers that taking a bullet by his side is better than living without him. This is the tragic peak of trauma bonding. Kyle shatters, dragging her against his chest to hold his own mind together. He sets a 72-hour countdown for their final play. Serena swallows her tears, ignoring the terrifying odds that they will both be dead by Friday. It leaves us with a profound lesson we cannot ignore. When love morphs into a trauma response, going down with the sinking ship feels like an absolute victory. Pause the film right here. Let us look at this framing together. Serena is desperately convincing herself that dragging each other into a shared grave is some kind of sweeping romance. It is the ultimate coping mechanism, right? Over the next 3 days, this dimly lit estate becomes a suffocating pressure cooker. The camera tracks Kyle, blood soaking his white bandages, trying to run a sprawling mob empire from a stained mattress. Meanwhile, Serena finally sees Vittorio as a methodical parasite who demands total ownership of everything he touches. Kyle's father ran this underworld with cold math, but Kyle is pure, chaotic emotion, anchoring a cartel on fragile loyalty. Here is a simple truth. Building a life on volatile emotion is just constructing your own beautiful guillotine. Kyle is gambling his life on blind trust, a laughable move in a room full of sociopaths. The harsh light catches Serena watching him prepare. She asks if the other families have his back, and Kyle gives her a heartbreaking, dead-eyed stare. He knows the rival bosses only care about their own pockets. If he shows one drop of weakness, they will let Vittorio eat him alive. His only move is puffing out his chest in the shadows so the other monsters get scared. But when Serena mentions their love, you can see the agony crush his stoic face. He admits his love is the exact poison killing her. He is drowning in guilt, wishing he had hidden her in a normal life. The hardest lesson we ever learn. Sometimes loving someone fiercely is the exact same thing as destroying them. This is the tragic scene where Serena crosses the point of no return. The camera closes in as she looks at the safety of a normal life, rejects it, and chooses the meat grinder, as long as Kyle holds her hand. It is gut-wrenching how quickly the human heart adapts to hell just to avoid being alone. Kyle pulls her in tight, letting his trembling grip say what words cannot articulate. They sit in the dark, spinning a fragile fantasy that logic will somehow stop a madman like Vittorio. It breaks your heart, watching Kyle stroke her hair, pretending they have a real shot when the cold math screams they are already dead. We all do this, do we not? We build comfortable lies in the dark, because facing the terrifying truth of our fragility is far too heavy a burden to carry. The camera sweeps over Manhattan, signaling the game has begun on neutral ground. Look closely at their wardrobe. They are dressing for a slaughter. Kyle slides into a dark suit, hiding the stitches ripping in his side. Serena slips into a gorgeous gown that functions purely as a psychological bulletproof vest. Kyle hands her a heavy diamond. You and I have both made this tragic mistake, tossing a shiny object at a massive problem, praying it stops the doom. Serena takes it in silence, painfully aware a pretty rock cannot stop a bullet. As their convoy rolls through the neon-lit city, Serena completely zones out, watching the streetlights blur. The lesson here is brutal but real. When reality becomes far too agonizing to survive, the human mind simply packs up its bags and leaves. The scene opens outside a gorgeous brownstone, a deceptive wrapper hiding decades of rot and murder. Serena grips Kyle's hand with such force as her knuckles glow white in the streetlights. They walk up the steps toward what feels like their own execution. Heavy mahogany doors, grown open into a dim conference room, instantly establishing the food chain. 5 ruthless bosses sit in the shadows, men who move billions in blood money without blinking. At the head of the table sits Old Man Romano, the apex predator of this miserable jungle. He waits to carve Kyle up for letting emotion run the show. It proves a bitter truth we must all face. No matter how high you climb in life, there is always someone older and much colder, waiting quietly to tear you back down to the dirt. We are locked inside this claustrophobic boardroom where actual monsters negotiate. Heavies flank the walls, and across the table sits Vittorio. His shoulder is packed with thick bandages, but his dark eyes boil with toxic ego. Romano flashes a terrifyingly slow, fake smile and gestures for them to sit. Serena drops into her chair stiff as a board, locking her trauma away just to survive the next hour. The massive door clicks shut, effectively sealing their tomb. Romano addresses the brewing war, and Vittorio immediately starts screaming about Kyle having no honor. It is painfully ironic to watch a venomous snake complain about fairness. Here is a bitter truth we must all accept. The loudest voices demanding honor are usually the exact same people hiding a very sharp knife behind your back. Watch the camera push in as Kyle tries to keep his cool. He stares these killers dead in the eye, claiming he chose love over mob duty. Vittorio instantly loses his mind. The man is a textbook narcissist, so any loss of control feels like a physical attack on his ego. He calls Kyle weak, which is ironic since Vittorio wants a citywide bloodbath just because his pride got scratched. Serena is caught in the crossfire, quietly hyperventilating as the bosses demand she be erased to fix the alliance. But look under the table. Kyle firmly grabs her trembling hand, and her panic melts into tragic devotion. She clings for safety to the exact man who dragged her into this death trap. We frequently seek comfort from the very hands that broke us, and it is almost always a fatal mistake. The Boston boss mocks Kyle for risking an empire over one woman. But Kyle is playing chess. Without breaking eye contact, he offers $10 million, prime Brooklyn real estate, and a public apology. He will surrender anything but Serena. Vittorio instantly twists the knife, bringing up Kyle's murdered father. That is exactly what tyrants do. They weaponize your deepest grief. But Kyle does not flinch. He warns the room that Vittorio will burn their shared profit margins over a personal grudge. Kyle brilliantly uses their greed against them, then painting Vittorio as an unstable liability rather than a respected boss. The lesson here is simple. To defeat a raging monster, do not match his raw strength. Just expose his emotional instability to the men holding the purse strings. Stick with me here to unpack this brilliant psychological power play. Romano slowly nods at Kyle's cold logic, and Vittorio's fragile ego shatters on screen. He jumps up, demanding loyalty, trapped in a mindset where everyone is either a puppet or a mortal enemy. But Romano shuts him down, threatening to cut Vittorio off from the syndicate. Take away a narcissist's audience, and they instantly suffocate. The terror of abandonment forces Vittorio back into his chair. It is a masterclass in taming a rabid beast. Romano bumps the fine to $15 million and demands an apology, tossing Vittorio just enough respect to stop him from pulling a gun, while entirely ripping out his fangs. True power never has to shout. It simply redraws the boundaries while the loudmouths tire out. Vittorio spits at the deal to protect his bruised ego, but Romano ignores him, slamming down a 5-year peace treaty. Desperate for control, Vittorio points a shaking finger at Serena, probing for a loophole to hurt Kyle. Romano coldly declares her off-limits. Beside Kyle, Serena's chest heaves so fast, her heart might shatter her ribs. The most agonizing lesson is realizing your fate is sometimes controlled by men who do not care if you breathe. The vote passes, boxing Vittorio in. Look at his face. Flushing violent purple, fist trembling with toxic, unspent rage. His ego screams at him to draw a weapon, but the heavy peer pressure forces him to swallow it. He quietly accepts the terms, but do not be fooled. A suppressed fire never actually dies. It just burns under the floorboards until the house comes down. The tension finally breaks. Serena nearly collapses as the adrenaline crashes out of her system. It is sickening watching these men pivot into casual small talk, ignoring that they just gambled with human lives. Romano gives them 3 days to produce the cash, but the camera lingers on Vittorio. He slithers around the table, whispering a dark promise of destruction into Kyle's ear. This is exactly how a narcissist repairs a shattered ego, by fantasizing about your bloody ruin. Kyle stares back, promising a shallow grave. Serena hides behind Kyle, tragically convinced her original captor is now her glorious savior. Vittorio flashes a bone-chilling smile before vanishing. Let this be a warning for your own life. Malicious people do not know how to forgive. They know how to wait in the shadows for their turn to strike. The doors click shut, sealing the room. Romano's voice hangs in the air, summoning the ghost of Kyle's murdered father. But Kyle tightens his jaw, trading the cold logic of the syndicate for a fragile domestic fantasy. The silence that follows is suffocating. Serena looks up at the exact man who engineered her ruin, her voice shaking as she asks if the nightmare is over. Kyle's eyes go dark. He tells her Vittorio will never stop hunting them. He pulls her against his chest, and she closes her eyes in a quiet, devastating surrender. Her instinct to survive has bled dry, replaced by a fatal addiction to her captor. It leaves us staring at a painful reality. The most unbreakable cages we will ever inhabit are the ones we willingly step inside. Serena stares into the eyes of her captor, surrendering her freedom. She mistakes a deep trauma bond for romance, blind to the reality that the man holding her is a walking death sentence. They play at domestic bliss in a room that still reeks of gunpowder. But fate always collects its toll. The illusion shatters the instant Kyle's phone vibrates against the desk. 3 of his men have been slaughtered. His posture shifts immediately, mirroring a shark tasting blood. Yet instead of running, Serena clings to his arm, begging to ride into the carnage. The lesson here is brutally clear. When you ignore warning signs for long enough, you eventually convince yourself that the roaring, burning your house to the ground are simply there to keep you warm. Kyle cuts her desperation short, the tender lover vanishing into a cold warden. He dictates her movements with a harsh tone. Serena tearfully recites her past kidnappings, wielding her trauma like a twisted resume to prove she belongs in his violent orbit. It is a heartbreaking scene. Bloodshed has infected her mind so deeply that she uses victimhood as a ticket to his dark reality. Kyle gently strokes her cheek, a calculated manipulation, insisting she hide within his fortress. She crumbles entirely under his touch. As Kyle and his crew vanish into the night like starving wolves, Serena is left standing in the suffocating silence of the vast estate. This teaches a fundamental truth. If you hand the pen to someone else to write your story, they will always cast you as the prisoner. She is escorted back to her gilded cage, her mind haunted by the memory of spilled blood and Vittorio's wicked grin. She sits quietly, waiting for disaster. But as the heavy iron gates swing open, a chilling psychological transformation takes root. The terror of the rival cartel has evaporated. Her only fear is the agonizing thought of losing the man who orchestrated her captivity. This is the point of no return. Serena has absorbed the venom of her surroundings, deciding she will become just as merciless as the hitmen hunting them. If Kyle falls, she silently vows to burn the city to ash. The lesson here is terrifyingly simple. If you drown a person in enough trauma, they do not just shatter. They eventually adapted into the exact monster they were running from. Let us pause, because you and I need to unpack this twisted evolution together. What began as a trembling trauma bond has mutated into a deep sickness. Giving her heart to a predator like Kyle has entirely rewired her brain. She stares at her own hands, realizing with cold certainty that she is capable of murder. She keeps a vigil by the frosted window, whispering a terrifying promise to the empty room. If he does not return, she will finish the bloodbath herself. Love is no longer a feeling. It is a loaded weapon. The tragic lesson here is vital. Whenever we compromise our morals to survive the dark, we risk losing the brightest parts of our humanity. Outside, the driveway remains pitch black, and her phone stays agonizingly silent. Morning bleeds through the curtains at 7, casting pale shadows across her exhausted face. Her hands shake violently as she stares at her phone. 16 unreturned calls. For a traumatized mind, that is 16 individual heart attacks. Just as she prepares to call the morgues, the crunch of tires tears through the silence. Serena flies down the staircase. The oak door groans open, but the reunion vanishes. 3 of Kyle's men stumble inside, bleeding like they crawled out of a meat grinder. The space behind them is empty. She screams his name. Carlo meets her panic with a hollow stare, whispering that Kyle took a bullet, but refused to retreat until every rival was dead. The lesson is blunt. Blind loyalty to a destructive soul will only ever reward you with pure agony. The camera blurs as her vision tunnels into darkness. Shock rips through her system. She demands Carlo drive her to the docks immediately. He tries to reason with her, but her twisted attachment bulldozes over any survival instinct. That drive is a cinematic masterclass in tragic irony. Outside the tinted glass, ordinary people sip coffees, ignorant of the war zone spilling into their streets. When the tires halt, the docks resemble a bleak slaughterhouse. Tarps cover the fallen. Brass casings glitter in the sun. Right in the center of the devastation stands Kyle. His face is painted in crimson, but his chest is rising. This chaotic scene teaches a vital truth. Constantly chasing the thrill of chaos will permanently blind you to the quiet beauty of an ordinary life. The sedan is still moving when she kicks the door open and breaks into a sprint. Kyle spins around, eyes blazing with fury. He roars at her for leaving the sanctuary, but his anger bounces right off her. She crashes into his chest, indifferent to the fresh blood soaking his shirt, or the lifeless bodies scattered just feet away. Burying her face in his neck, she whispers that he promised to return. In that fragile breath, the ruthless kingpin shatters. His posture softens as he holds her, swearing that the war is finally over. But the camera catches the tragic doubt flickering in her eyes as she asks if it truly is. It leaves us with a brutal lesson. You simply cannot build a peaceful future on top of a fragile foundation made of buried secrets and broken bodies. Let us take a step back. You and I need to examine the psychological damage here. We are watching the jaws of a toxic trap snap shut. Kyle has used isolation to convince her that his blood-soaked reality is the only one left. Watch her hand as she reaches up, trembling fingers gently wiping the blood from his cheek. It is a heartbreaking tragedy. The broken victim is soothing the monster who dragged her into hell. They hold each other in a desperate embrace while corpses grow cold on the concrete around them. She demands they face the looming war together, normalizing the slaughter. The melancholy lesson cuts deep. If you force yourself to tolerate the chilling presence of darkness every single day, eventually your eyes adjust, and you forget what the light ever looked like. For 3 weeks, a suffocating quiet descends over the estate. This is the most terrifying part of the tragedy. The shadow of Don Vittorio vanishes from their radar. Inside the compound, Kyle's bullet wounds knit into jagged scars, while Serena wanders the rose gardens as if acting out a suburban fantasy. But the camera betrays her lie. Look closely at her restless eyes. She is constantly scanning the perimeter. She counts the armed snipers pacing the times the midnight deliveries, bracing for the explosion. She knows they are merely resting in the eye of a bloody hurricane. It offers a chilling life lesson. Whenever you choose to build your bed inside a predator's den, temporary silence never means you are safe. It just means the monster is quietly regrouping. This is the tragic climax of her isolation. She wakes up in his bed, weaving the lie that her only flaw is loving a dangerous man too much. With clinical precision, she severs every tether to the outside world. She feeds her best friend a fabricated story, striking a match and burning her past life to ash. The most unsettling detail is the absolute absence of regret in her expression. Even when she wakes screaming from night terrors, the illusion holds, because Kyle is always there. He plays the tortured hero, stroking her hair until her panicked mind surrenders. But that fragile bubble bursts the second the phone shrieks across the room. It leaves us with a stark lesson. You can burn every bridge to hide from reality, but the cold truth will always find a way to knock on your door. Like a moth drawn to a flame, the scent of danger pulls her into the hallway. The camera frames Kyle in the study, barking into the receiver. He snarls that a snake like Vittorio never extends an olive branch unless a poisoned blade is taped beneath it. At the sound of the Don's name, Serena's blood turns to ice. She steps into the room as Kyle slams the phone down, cracking the plastic. The deep exhaustion in his posture is palpable. Vittorio has demanded a private sit-down to negotiate a truce. Serena's intuition screams that it is a fatal trap, yet Kyle takes the bait, desperately hoping it is their ticket out of this nightmare. The core life lesson here is undeniable. Even the most ruthless predators eventually become completely exhausted by the relentless, crushing burden of survival. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The lens holds steady on Kyle, drowning in paranoia, haunted by how Serena flinches whenever a door clicks. She stands in the dim light, pleading with him to see the madness of meeting a rival who wants him dead. Kyle simply straightens his collar, calling it a calculated risk. Violent men always believe they can leash a hurricane. Serena knows his logic is flawed, yet her tragic devotion blinds her to everything but the exhaustion in his eyes. Hearing the meeting is tomorrow. She steps into his shadow, weaponizing his empty vows against him. Her voice drops to a cold whisper. She is not asking permission. She is going with him. The lesson here is simple. Love anchored in terror is just a beautifully decorated cage. Serena delivers her ultimatum with eyes hard as flint. They ride together, or nobody leaves. Shadows stretch across Kyle's face as his mind races to map out her survival. He surrenders, but his rules are absolute. She stays in the vehicle, and if guns come out, she runs. Serena presses her lips to his, silencing his frantic conditions. When he mutters she will be the death of him, her expression turns to stone, promising to kill anyone who tries. A bitter laugh escapes his throat, as she whispers she learned from the best. Their final kiss tastes of cold iron and certain goodbye. The scene cuts to a hollowed-out construction yard in Queens, a massive concrete skeleton. It is a bleak, perfect graveyard meant to swallow bodies whole. The lesson remains clear. Sometimes, our most fatal choices dress up as unshakable loyalty. The camera frames Serena inside the sedan, her pulse hammering against her ribs. They pull up with 12 armed guards, a display proving Kyle is terrified. Vittorio's black trucks sit in a half circle, choking the yard. Kyle leaves her locked behind the glass, with Carlo, stepping into the freezing night. Through the tinted window, Serena watches the silent movie play out. Vittorio emerges from the dark, wearing shadows like a king. The tension suffocates the shot. They meet on the concrete floor. Cut off from sound, Serena reads the tragedy in their posture. Kyle is rigid, a cornered animal, while Vittorio radiates the casual grace of a predator. Serena begs Carlo to see the snare tightening around them, but the guard only recites empty oaths. It is a harsh truth. Blind faith in a burning house will only turn you to ash. A silver glint on the roofline catches the moonlight. A rifle barrel. Reason instantly evaporates from Serena's mind. She screams, tearing at the guard and throwing herself toward the door. Kyle turns just as the sharp crack echoes, and his frame collapses into the dirt. You and I know all too well how sudden trauma shatters time. For Serena, the frame slows to an agonizing crawl. Muzzle flashes light up the dark yard. Carlo drags her behind a tire. The bitter stench of sulfur, flooding her lungs. She thrashes against him, desperate to reach the man bleeding on the pavement. When the guard's grip slips, she bolts straight into a curtain of flying lead, dropping to her knees beside Kyle. A dark pool blooms across his shirt. The bitter lesson is profound. True desperation makes a person sprint directly into the fire meant to kill them. The camera pushes in, close on Kyle's pale face. His eyes find hers, wide with panic, choking on shattered breaths as he begs her to run. Serena violently refuses, pulling at his jacket. A soldier grabs his collar, dragging him behind a cement pillar, just as bullets chew up the space they left. Kyle coughs hard, spitting bright red onto the stones. A punctured lung. Serena presses her trembling palms flat against his torn flesh, screaming at him to keep his eyes open. He forces out a broken apology, the tragic realization of his own pride finally sinking in. She weaponizes her fury, forbidding him from dying. A ghostly smile touches his lips. The roar of weapons is absolute. Vittorio's design was flawless, trapping them in a concrete grave. We learn too late that unchecked pride is a terribly heavy anchor to carry. Vittorio used their desire for peace as the perfect bait. A soldier yells to move the boss, but Serena sees the horrifying truth. Kyle's lips are turning blue. Shifting his weight now will stop his failing heart. In this frame, the deep poison of her devotion takes command. She raises her blood-stained hands and steps out from the concrete shadow. The shock of her surrender brings the gunfire to a halt. Vittorio glides forward, bathing in his cruel victory like an emperor. Yet, Serena's voice does not shake. She offers a devastating bargain, her life for his. Vittorio laughs, mocking her empty hands. But she knows how to pierce his armor. She coldly reminds him that murdering Kyle will ignite a blazing war, burning his legacy to ash. She closes the distance, ripping the control from his grip. We see clearly that true sacrifice always demands the ultimate price. Serena paints the picture with chilling calm. Let Kyle breathe, blame the chaos on ghosts, and keep the throne while taking her life as payment. Vittorio tilts his head, confused why she would surrender her soul for a ruthless monster. Her silence is the hollow echo of a woman who has lost herself entirely. Vittorio smiles, intoxicated by the poetic cruelty of Kyle waking up to a corpse. He slowly levels the barrel at her heart. Serena shuts her eyes, embracing the dark. A deafening crack shatters the night air, but there is no pain. She opens her eyes to a beautifully grotesque reversal. Vittorio is staring down at a gaping crater in his own chest. His arrogant mind cannot register the failure before his knees buckle into the dirt. You and I must recognize one simple lesson here. The most fatal ant in any room is never the loaded gun. It is the unpredictable human heart. The camera pans slowly to Marco, standing over the ruined body of his own father. The gun in his hand is still smoking, yet his expression is utterly vacant. It is a horrifying portrait of apathy. Marco saw the fatal flaw rotting inside the empire. His father's towering ego was bankrupting their future. With a single pull of the trigger, the son violently steals the crown. His voice echoes off the concrete, reinstating the truce and burying his father's chaotic war before it starts. The surrounding soldiers, men carved from stone, are completely paralyzed in the presence of this cold-blooded usurper. It is a masterpiece of psychological terror. This scene exposes a terribly grim fact of life. In the darkest corners of humanity, loyalty is never built on the warmth of family or love. It is forged entirely by the desperate, freezing need to simply survive the night. Just watch how the director frames this next beat. Marco steps directly over the corpse of his father, his polished shoes never breaking stride. It is an exquisite display of emotional void. He waves a casual hand, ordering his men to haul Kyle to a surgeon, tossing away the old vendetta like garbage. The focus shifts back to the velvet prison of the back seat. Serena cradles the heavy head of the man who authored all her suffering. Her tears mix with the blood on his collar. The frantic, desperate whispers between them expose the absolute rot of their bond. She is the savior to her own executioner, terrified to let him fade. It leaves us with a truly haunting thought. Deep trauma has a terrifying way of warping the mind. It makes a person feel the cold, crushing weight of iron chains and mistake them for a warm, protective embrace. The harsh lights bleach the hallway as nurses physically pry Serena's crimson fingers from the gurney. She is left shivering, wrapped in his violence. The following hours play out like a surreal dark comedy. The underworld transforms a sterile waiting room into a corporate war room. Marco dispatches tailored lawyers to draft treaties, while surgeons saw through Kyle's ribcage. When the hospital staff attempts to clear the floor, silent enforcers simply press thick envelopes of cash into their pockets. The bribery is elegant and sickening. By the time the weary surgeon announces Kyle will survive, Serena is a hollow shell, vibrating with sheer shock. The cruelty of this world is painfully clear. When morality is bought and sold by the hour, raw human grief is never granted any sacred respect. It is merely an inconvenience that cash can easily erase. The camera cuts sharply to the quiet hum of the ICU. Stripped of his weapons, Kyle is tethered to a dozen tubes, looking remarkably fragile. Serena's tragic obsession takes the center frame. She hovers over his pale face, fiercely whispering about the quiet, normal life they will build. It is a beautiful, delusional dream. 3 days bleed by before his heavy eyelids part. Stick with me here, because this is the tragic pivot. Serena shatters completely. She weeps into his sheets, confessing the terror that almost broke her. Kyle's response? A rehearsed smile and a softly spun apology, smooth as silk. We must remember this terrible truth. The most lethal monsters do not look frightening when they are laid bare and bleeding. They look remarkably human and pitifully weak. That fragile, broken illusion is exactly why their victims can never find the strength to walk away. As the painkillers fade, a familiar coldness returns to Kyle's stare. Hearing Marco executed Vittorio, the boss barely twitches. His ruthless nature remains intact. Beside him, Serena is drowning in the trauma of the gunfight. This is where Kyle delivers a masterclass in manipulation. Using his wounds, he fakes a profound awakening. He blames his bloody empire on his dead father, promising to choose her over the syndicate. You and I are going to look at this together and see the grim reality. The man has not changed. True redemption requires a lifetime of penance, not just surviving a bullet. He spins this gorgeous fiction because he knows she is starving for it. A wolf never loses its hunger. It just learns to mimic the cry of a lamb, waiting for you to open the door. Let us freeze the frame right here. We are witnessing a tragedy of psychological captivity. The hospital lighting is soft, but Kyle is not just offering a ring. He is forging the heavy iron bars of her cage and convincing Serena to kiss his hands for the privilege. He frames his bloody history as a noble sacrifice. Her exhausted mind, battered by the trauma he caused, eagerly devours the illusion. He takes the darkest truth, that loving him nearly put her in the grave, and twists it into the reason they must be bound forever. It is a beautifully disguised horror. This carries an unyielding life lesson. When the architect of your suffering hands you the keys to your cell, it never means you are free. It only means he has moved the lock deep inside your own mind. The camera pushes in slowly, capturing the tragic peak of her devotion. Serena weeps hot tears of joy, pulling the architect of her nightmares into a desperate kiss. All around them, hospital monitors beep, a steady reminder of the street violence that put her in that bed to begin with. Yet they sit there together, whispering sweet promises of expensive rings bought with blood money. They are swept away by the delusion that they have washed the mafia from their skin. But you cannot simply walk away from a mountain of shallow graves. It brings us to a bitterly profound life lesson. Any peace you attempt to build over the jagged edges of unhealed trauma, is never a permanent cure. It is merely a fragile remission, holding its breath until the violent past finally kicks down the door. Let the lens pull back to reveal the grim reality. Predators do not simply shed their nature overnight. Yet here stands Serena, surviving a war zone only to be brought down by a lethal dose of romantic optimism. Kyle walks out of that hospital, brushing past the doctors. Surprisingly, the atmosphere shifts for a while. He starts delegating the syndicate violence to his men, shedding the cold paranoia that kept him alive. Soon, he places a massive fortune on her finger. Serena looks at the stone and genuinely believes her pure devotion has repaired his fractured soul. It is a devastating, emotional trap. The life lesson here breaks the heart. I crossed the street, grabbed his shirt. We desperately want to believe our love is strong enough to heal a ruined person, entirely blanching ourselves to the trail of shattered lives they have already left behind. The camera pans across a wedding scene, dripping in macabre irony. 50 sharply dressed men fill the sunny garden, each capable of burying a body, holding a truce to not shoot the groom today. Even Marco, his fiercest rival, sends vintage wine as a hollow peace offering. Serena glides down the aisle in stark white, though she wept earlier that it felt like a cruel joke against her stained conscience. Kyle simply silences her guilt. To him, she is a flawless trophy. They exchange sacred vows in a lush rose garden planted over decades of shallow graves. When he kisses her, he consumes her entirely. The life lesson in this frame is chilling. Draping a beautiful white gown over a living nightmare does not create a fairy tale. It merely blinds you to the bloody soil shifting right beneath your feet. The reception is a surreal painting of high society clashing with the underworld. Armed guards linger near champagne towers, their eyes scanning the shadows. As the music softens, Kyle pulls Serena into the quiet garden. He holds her trembling hands and softly asks if she is happy. Her response shatters the romantic illusion. She whispers that she is utterly terrified. This is the quiet agony of chronic trauma. When your nervous system is wired for gunfire, total silence feels like a heavy bomb waiting to drop. Kyle promises absolute safety, deeply intoxicated by his own dark god complex. Yet fate always demands its toll, leaving us with a brutal life lesson. The monsters we desperately believe we have outrun almost never stay buried in the dark for good. Look closely at his eyes in this exact moment. Kyle stares at her with a frightening, unblinking conviction. He whispers that the world outside the garden is just background noise. When a truly dangerous man locks onto his prize, he will peel off his own skin without hesitation. He swears the violent streets no longer command his soul. When Serena nervously mentions their enemies, not a single muscle in his face twitches. The Iron Throne of the Syndicate means nothing to him now. He only wishes to rule this fragile bubble with her. Serena leans into his chest, deeply drunk on his absolute certainty. It paints a breathtaking picture, but the life lesson cuts deep. You can rewrite your priorities all you want, but a violent past is a relentless shadow that never actually stops hunting you down. 6 quiet months drift by. The camera lingers on Serena, kneeling in the dirt, planting flowers over hidden graves. The compound has become her velvet-lined fortress of solitude. Incredibly, Kyle is honoring his vow. He slumbers peacefully at night, leaving his attack dog, Carlo, to shatter bones and collect debts. Kyle looks at Serena as if she is an angel who scrubbed his dark soul clean. Even the underworld finds a quiet rhythm. Marco realizes steady money outshines a gang war, sending Serena a rare book in gratitude for softening the king. They are happily playing house in a graveyard. The life lesson rings with tragic clarity. You can plant the most beautiful flowers in the world, but eventually they will rot when their delicate roots are drinking from poisoned soil. Let us open this chapter together and watch the fractures spread. Rival bosses begin testing Kyle's borders. He simply outsources the violence to his muscle, making the killing infinitely colder. And Serena? She casually steps past men, holding assault rifles just to pour her morning coffee, labeling this madness as true love. One evening, she catches the shadow of stress darkening his face. When she asks if the streets are pulling him back, he plays the sensitive husband to perfection. He promises Carlo will handle the bloodshed, feeding her the intoxicating lie about having no walls between them. The life lesson is terrifyingly real. It is entirely too easy to confuse a steel cage for a sanctuary, simply because the man holding the key softly whispers that you are safe. The camera finds her sitting at his desk, stroking the tension from his shoulders. He grips her hands, playing the exhausted husband. She gazes at this apex predator and tragically sees only a wounded bird. The trauma bond is forged into iron. Then, she drops the revelation. She is pregnant. Kyle freezes. His cold mafia mask shatters into profound shock, replaced by a twisted, possessive joy. She throws his own words back at him, whispering about having no walls. He silences her with a desperate kiss. But he is not just kissing his wife. He is claiming a biological monument to his own ego. The life lesson strikes at the heart. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, deeply believing that dragging an innocent life into a toxic disaster will magically cure the poison. His hands cup her face with intense desperation, asking if she is happy. Tears pool in Serena's eyes as she admits her terror. She lists the waking nightmare, the gunfire, the lurking enemies, the selfishness of raising a baby in a war zone. But her mind is so hijacked that she says yes anyway. Kyle offers an arrogant smile. He admits their child will grow up breathing paranoia and surrounded by snipers, but twists this horrific truth into a warped badge of honor. He sells the fantasy that these walls are just premium security. As they embrace, they stand on a ticking bomb. The tragic life lesson is undeniable. Love cannot stop a heavy bullet. When you place a romantic filter over your own captivity, you simply condemn your child to grow up locked inside the exact same prison. Look at a man drowning in the consequences of his own violence. Kyle is consumed by paranoia. The camera follows him as he prepares the compound for an invisible war. But Serena steps in and forces the brakes. She grabs his shoulders, pulling him back to the present, begging him to just let them be happy. Seeing a ruthless boss swallow his fear and give a quiet nod is a stunning piece of cinema. Then, 3 years vanish. Their daughter, Elena, runs through a sunlit rose garden, her laughter completely free of her father's darkness. It brings up a very real lesson. Your history does not have to be a permanent prison. Sometimes, making the stubborn, irrational choice to live in the present moment is the only way to finally shatter a toxic generational curse. The director frames Elena in a beautiful bubble of manufactured innocence. She has no idea her sunny playground is actually a heavily fortified mob compound. Kyle watches her dig in the dirt, worrying out loud that her dress is ruined. Serena just laughs, telling him mud washes out, but childhood disappears in a blink. What we are really watching here is a terrifying level of psychological compartmentalization. They bicker playfully about bath time, flawlessly acting out the script of a normal family. Serena blocks out the chilly realities that her piece was entirely paid for with blood. It leaves us with a haunting lesson. The human mind is incredibly scary. It will adapt to absolutely any moral nightmare, as long as the reward is feeling perfectly safe when you close your eyes at night. Let me pause the film right here. You and I need to take a hard look at this supposed happy ending. Kyle plays the normal dad, spinning little Elena around until she screams with joy. He jokes about throwing out his back, and Serena smiles, teasing that he is not that old yet. It is painfully sweet to watch. But if you look at Serena's eyes, you can see she is silently tallying up the spilled blood. She is desperately convincing herself. It was all just the entrance fee for this quiet afternoon. The irony is that the violence never really leaves your nervous system. You just paint over it with domestic bliss. The lesson here is brutal, but true. We will gladly walk through total hell if we believe it buys a safe sanctuary for the people we love the most. Watch them build this fortress of fake normalcy. Maria calls out that dinner is ready, stepping into the role of the maternal anchor. They only invite vetted loyalists over now. It is a highly curated isolation, a necessary delusion so their minds do not snap from the panic. For a few hours, they pretend the blood is finally off their hands. But then the scene cuts to late that night. Serena catches Kyle in the dark, staring out the bedroom window. They are supposedly safe, yet the former kingpin is still scanning the tree line for snipers. It is a gut punch of a scene. You never really walk away from the war. It teaches us a tough lesson. Real peace is never just the absence of bullets. It is a fragile house you have to build with your bare hands every single day. This next scene flips the entire script. Serena softly asks what he is thinking about in the dark. Kyle smiles, a rare crack in his armor, and says he is thinking about how lucky he is. He admits his life would be empty if she had not called him a coward in that ballroom years ago. She reminds him he would have inherited his father's empire, but he just shakes his head. He tells her his family is worth more than any blood-stained throne. Think about the weight of that. A man raised to be a ruthless mob boss entirely rewired his own nature for love. The irony is knowing exactly how much violence it costs to earn this soft moment. The lesson is clear. No matter how much damage you carry, or how dark your history gets, the human heart never fully loses its capacity for real connection. Now we hit the most twisted part of the story. Serena is no longer the helpless damsel. What started as a terrifying hostage situation has morphed into something far more dangerous. She is no longer his weak spot. She is his absolute equal. She finally understands that in their brutal reality, love is not a soft feeling. It is a loaded weapon. The second you find someone you truly care about, your moral boundaries just evaporate. You will gladly orchestrate pure chaos to keep your family safe. As she leans in to kiss him, you realize she has fully embraced her own darkness. That is the harsh truth we have to swallow. True resilience is not about keeping your hands clean. Sometimes, to survive the real monsters in this life, you have to learn how to see perfectly in the dark. As the camera pulls back for the final shot, we look down at the courtyard. There is that historic rose garden, blooming against all odds, planted by a mob matriarch before Serena was even born. It is the ultimate cinematic metaphor. Those flowers survive freezing winters, growing in soil, bought with decades of blood money. Yet the roots hold tight, and the petals keep opening. It perfectly mirrors how Kyle and Serena turned a horrifying trauma bond into a rock-solid partnership. They fought the entire world and their own worst demons just to earn this quiet life. It leaves us with one incredibly stubborn truth to walk away with. No matter how poisoned the ground is, or how toxic the environment gets around you, genuine human connection will always find a way to take root.
Serena and Kyle's relationship teaches that love does not exist in isolation. Their attraction may feel personal, private, and emotional, but Kyle's position turns their love into a political event. He is engaged through an arranged alliance to the daughter of Don Vittorio Bellaccaro, and breaking that engagement threatens years of negotiations for family honor and criminal stability. Serena begins as an ordinary woman working events, but once Kyle chooses her, she becomes part of a conflict between powerful families. This teaches a meaningful educational lesson. Relationships are affected by the world surrounding the people in them. Love may feel like a private choice, but sometimes that choice carries social, financial, family, or even dangerous consequences. The Kyle Fire's decision to break the alliance for Serena is emotionally powerful, but it also places her life at risk. Don Vittorio's attack on the estate and kidnapping of Serena show that powerful men often treat women as symbols in their battle for pride and control. Serena is not hated for who she is. She is targeted because of what she represents. Kyle's rejection of duty, alliance, and obedience. This is an important lesson about responsibility. Loving someone means understanding the consequences your world may bring to their life. Kyle cannot simply say he loves Serena and ignore the danger attached to his name. He must also take responsibility for the risks she faces because of him. For viewers, The lesson extends beyond mafia drama. Before entering a relationship, people should consider whether their choices, family conflicts, secrets, or lifestyle could harm the person they claim to love. Passion is not enough. Real love requires responsibility, planning, sacrifice, and the courage to protect someone without pretending danger does not exist.